Hey guys, picture this. The sky's turned into a busted subway line, and you're the last passenger on the Cloud Express, a night train that runs on thunderclouds and caffeine-fueled dreams. And trust me, the conductor is definitely not a fairy, more like a bored barista with a cape. Before we drift off, smash that like button if you love midnight escapades, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, your bedroom, a bunker, or the back of a refrigerator. Now dim the lights, grab a cozy blanket, and maybe a half-eaten cookie, because you're about to board a platform that rattles like an old refrigerator door in a horror movie. You step onto the rickety deck, the cold metal whispering against your shoes while a sharp ozone scent tickles your nose like a neon-lit bonfire, and the wind whips a chorus of distant crickets and distant city sirens into a low-key jazz riff. The carriage shudders, sighing a rumble that feels like a disgruntled dragon trying to nap, and the windows fog up with the sighs of forgotten bedtime stories. Yeah, it's as cozy as it sounds. So would you stare at the constellations or crash into a pillow of oblivion? Drop your answer below, hit that like, and let's ride this midnight cloud together. The amber sun sank behind the cobblestone rooftops as Luna tugged Zephyr's feathered sleeve. The twilight terminal glowed like a lantern caught in a storm, its ticket booth humming with the scent of roasted chestnuts and ozone. Luna's boots squeaked on the polished marble, echoing against the vaulted arches that seemed older than the kingdom's legend. She flashed a grin at her owl, who blinked an eye as though winking at a secret only birds and night owls know. Above them, a silvered cloud ribbon pulsed, promising a ride that would make even the bravest troubadour jealous. A brass bell chimed, announcing the arrival of the Cloud Express, its carriages drifting like puffs of cotton candy stuck to a dragon's tail. Sir Nimbus, the conductor, stepped forward, his coat embroidered with storm clouds that crackled faintly whenever he raised an eyebrow. He tipped his hat, revealing a jaunty feather that smelled faintly of rain-drenched pine and mischief. With a voice that sounded like distant thunder politely asking for directions, he welcomed Luna and Zephyr aboard. The owl hooted a polite woo that sounded suspiciously like a meme-ified owl from an old internet video, earning a chuckle from the crowd. The train coughed a gust of wind that smelled of wet laundry and fresh mint, then shuddered forward as if a giant exhaled. Luna felt the deck sway beneath her boots, the wood creaking like an old pirate ship negotiating a wave of marshmallows. Zephyr perched on the railing, his talons clicking against the iron like castanets in a flamenco showdown. Sir Nimbus raised his silver baton, and the clouds beneath the express unfurled like a velvet carpet, whisking them into the moonlit sky. Stars peppered the darkness, each one a glittering eye watching their ascent, while a faint smell of burnt toast lingered from the terminal's lingering breakfast queue. Luna's heart thumped a rhythm that could outdance a drum solo at a rock concert. As they climbed higher, a mischievous wind slipped a rogue tumbleweed into the carriage, rattling the windows with a squeaky protest. Zephyr swatted it away, sending the tumbleweed spiraling into a nearby moonbeam, where it vanished with a theatrical poof. Sir Nimbus laughed, noting that even clouds have a sense of humor, especially when they're fed too many late-night cookies. Luna glanced down and saw the world shrink to a patchwork quilt of twinkling lanterns, feeling both tiny and triumphantly enormous. A distant owl hoot, oddly reminiscent of a 90s sitcom laugh track, echoed through the night, reminding her that adventure often wears a disguise of absurdity. She tightened her grip on the rail, ready for whatever mischief the moon might toss her way. The Cloud Express hummed onward, its wheels turning like the gears of an ancient clock tower that had just discovered espresso. Luna whispered a promise to the night sky, vowing to return with stories that would make the court jester blush. Zephyr, now perched lazily with a half-eaten worm, sighed contentedly, his feathers rustling like the pages of a well-used adventure novel. Sir Nimbus tipped his hat once more, his smile flickering like a candle caught in a gentle breeze, hinting at the challenges that glimmered beyond the horizon. The carriage surged forward, disappearing into a curtain of silver mist, leaving behind only the faint echo of laughter and the sweet smell of adventure. The Cloud Express shivered as it slipped into a thick veil of silver mist, the kind of fog that smells like old laundry left out in a thunderstorm. The hull groaned under the damp weight, and the crew's lanterns flickered like nervous fireflies. Every breath tasted of cold metal and distant rain, while the world outside turned into a watercolor of ghostly shapes. Even the engine's usual purr was muffled, as if the mist itself were swallowing sound. Hidden whirlwinds lurked like mischievous kittens, invisible until they snatched at the ship's side with a sudden, icy grip. Zephyr, ever the daring scout, shouted warnings that sounded like a pirate radio station stuck on repeat. The crew clung to railings, their boots slick with condensation that dripped onto the deck like nervous sweat. When a gust spun a sack of flour into a cloud of snow-white dust, the whole crew erupted in a chorus of coughing and laughter, as if the mist were pulling a prank on a sitcom set. Luna, perched by the navigation chart, squinted at the clouds as if they were ancient runes waiting to be decoded. She learned to read the tiniest ripples, a silver thread pulling taut, a whisper of a curl that hinted at a vortex ahead. Each subtle shift sent a shiver down her spine, a mix of awe and the sour scent of ozone that makes your nose tingle. By the time the mist thickened, she could predict a whirl's turn faster than a seasoned chess master calls checkmate. Zephyr, ever the front-line explorer, darted ahead on a narrow platform, his cape fluttering like a flag in a parade of wind. He returned with a grin and a tail of a tiny wind sprite, half transparent and wearing a grin wider than the Cheshire Cat. The sprite twirled around the express, blowing bubbles of vapor that popped with a sound like popcorn in a microwave. Its prank was to nudge the ship toward a dead-end canyon, a move as cheeky as a toddler stealing the last cookie. Luna, armed with her newfound cloud-reading skill, shouted a command that cut through the mist like a trumpet blast at a medieval fair. She guided the crew to steer into a gentle eddy, coaxing the sprite into a harmless dance that sent it spiraling into a puff of harmless glitter. The mist began to thin, revealing a sunrise that painted the sky in shades of marmalade and gold, as if the universe were rewarding their perseverance. With a sigh of relief and a chorus of exhausted chuckles, the Cloud Express rolled on, leaving the mischievous sprite to plot its next caper somewhere beyond the horizon. The sky turned a bruised violet as the Cloud Express thundered into the heart of a sudden storm, and lightning cracked the clouds like a cosmic drum solo. Rain hammered the carriage's polished brass ribs, turning the deck into a slick, sloshy mess that smelled of ozone and wet wool. The wind roared louder than a stadium full of cheering fans, flinging gusts that slapped the windows with a wet, stinging slap. Sir Nimbus, his silver mane crackling with static, shouted over the din, his voice a booming baritone that seemed to wrestle the thunder itself. Luna clutched the wooden rail, feeling the cold spray of the storm sting her cheeks like a mischievous prankster. Sir Nimbus, ever the stoic knight of the skies, pointed a gloved finger at Luna and said, "Calm your heart, girl, or you'll be tossed like a soggy pancake." Luna inhaled the electric scent of the storm, letting the sharp tang settle in her lungs, then exhaled, feeling the frantic beat of her pulse slow to a steady drum. She imagined herself as a seasoned Jedi, lightsaber humming, but swapped the saber for a quiet mind that glowed brighter than any lightning bolt. With each breath, the chaos outside seemed to lose a little of its edge, as if the storm were listening to a lullaby she hummed under her breath. Sir Nimbus chuckled, noting that even the heavens respect a good Zen moment, though he added, "Don't get too comfy, we still have to drive this thing." Guided by Luna's newfound serenity, Sir Nimbus took the reins, and the express lurched forward, its wheels grinding against the thunderclouds like a horse on a cobblestone street. The carriage's wheels spun, spraying a fine mist that caught the lightning, turning the whole scene into a glittering disco ball in the sky. The wind howled, trying to yank the express off course, but Luna's steady hands guided the tiller with the precision of a video game pro navigating a boss fight. They ducked under a bolt that struck a nearby cumulus, hearing the crack like a giant snapping twig, and the smell of burnt ozone filled the cabin, making Luna's nose twitch. Sir Nimbus let out a hearty laugh, remarking that the storm was basically the sky's version of a roller coaster, and he was glad Luna wasn't screaming like a toddler on a merry-go-round. Just when the tempest seemed intent on swallowing them whole, Luna's keen eyes spotted a faint, shimmering arch hidden behind a veil of rain, an ancient sky bridge long forgotten by cartographers. The bridge was woven from translucent crystal vines that glowed a soft teal, humming with a low, resonant tone like a forgotten cathedral organ. Sir Nimbus steered the express toward it, and the carriage slipped onto the bridge with a sigh, as if the structure itself exhaled relief. The bridge swayed gently, its surface slick with rain, yet it held firm, guiding them above the roiling chaos below. Luna couldn't help but whisper, "It's like finding a secret level in an old arcade game," and Sir Nimbus replied, "Only this one has better graphics and no quarter needed." The Cloud Express glided across the sky bridge, the storm's fury muffled to a distant growl, like an angry crowd heard through a thick wall. The air grew sweeter, carrying the faint perfume of high-altitude blossoms that only bloom after a thunderstorm, while the rain fell away in sparkling ribbons. As they emerged on the other side, the clouds cleared to reveal a golden sunrise that painted the horizon in shades of amber and rose. Sir Nimbus tipped his hat, declaring that Luna had turned a nightmare into a triumph worthy of a legend sung by bards. Luna laughed, wiping a smear of rain from her cheek, and quipped that next time she'd bring a popcorn bucket for the show, because who wouldn't want front-row seats to a sky-high drama? The Cloud Express roared upward like a steam engine dragon, its brass pistons huffing clouds into frothy swirls. Luna clutched the rail, feeling the wind slap her cheeks with the salty bite of a sea spray storm. Below, the world shrank into a patchwork quilt of twinkling towns and snoring farms, each light a firefly caught in a jar. As the train climbed, the air grew thin and crisp, tasting faintly of ozone and burnt toast, an odd breakfast for a sky-bound traveler. With a triumphant whistle, the locomotive pierced the last veil of low-lying mist, announcing its arrival at the fabled skyward summit. At the summit, the sky unfurled like a giant sapphire tapestry, stitched with golden threads of sunrise that never set. The ancient cloud crown hovered above a pedestal of vapor, pulsing with a soft amber glow that made the surrounding clouds quiver like startled cats. Luna's nose caught the sweet, metallic scent of charged lightning mingled with the earthy perfume of rain-soaked pine. A choir of distant thunder rumbled, as if the heavens themselves were humming a lullaby for the night. The scene felt both majestic and absurdly like a Disney movie set that had forgotten to turn off the special effects. From the crown's radiant, aura-stepped Aurora, the Guardian, draped in robes that shimmered like a disco ball at a 70s dance-off. She raised a hand, and the air crackled with the scent of ozone and old library books, knowledge that had been waiting for a fresh mind to sniff. "Answer my riddle, brave one," Aurora intoned, her voice echoing like a megaphone at a medieval town square. "I am not alive, yet I grow. I have no lungs, yet I need air. I can drown you without water." What am I? The question hung in the sky, as weighty as a Netflix binge-watching guilt trip. Luna's mind sprinted, dodging the riddle's traps like a cat avoiding a laser pointer. She chuckled, recalling a childhood science fair where she once called a fire as a hungry dragon that eats oxygen. "You are a fire," she declared, her voice steady despite the absurdity of debating a spectral guardian about combustion. Aurora's eyes flickered, half amused, half impressed, as the crown's glow brightened like a smartphone screen at midnight. The Guardian laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane, and stepped aside, granting Luna passage with a wink that said, "You passed, but don't get cocky, kid." The cloud crown settled gently onto Luna's head, its weight a comforting pressure, like a warm blanket on a cold night. A soft hum resonated through the train, vibrating the wooden seats and coaxing the engine to purr like a contented cat. The scent of fresh rain mingled with the faint aroma of popcorn from a distant carnival, promising adventures yet to come. With the crown's blessing, the express glided down the summit, its wheels humming a lullaby that promised a safe night's journey for every dreamer aboard. And as the stars blinked approvingly, Luna whispered, "Good night, sky. Let's see where the next cloud takes us," echoing the timeless spirit of explorers who once chased horizons on winged horses. When Luna whispered the final line of the riddle, the cloud crown shimmered like a disco ball in a thunderstorm. A soft, humming vibration pulsed through the crown, and the express felt a feather-light tug at its prow. Sir Nimbus, ever the flamboyant conductor, tipped his brim and declared the sky ready for a graceful descent. The wind, now a courteous valet, brushed the hull with a sigh that smelled faintly of ozone and fresh coffee. In that instant, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. The express answered the crown's invitation with a glide smoother than a buttered otter sliding down a waterfall. Below, the meadow unfolded like a silver blanket, speckled with fireflies that flickered like tiny paparazzi. The grass whispered secrets, rustling under the weight of dew that tasted like cold cucumber on a hot day. A distant owl hooted a lullaby while a mischievous raccoon rummaged through trash, adding a crunchy soundtrack to the scene. The moonlight painted everything in a glow that made even the shadows feel warmly invited. Luna hopped off the deck, her boots leaving prints that glowed for a heartbeat before fading, and Zephyr flapped his wings in a theatrical bow. Sir Nimbus, with a flourish worthy of a 19th-century stage magician, tipped his hat and muttered, "Until next time, my sky-bound friends, don't let the clouds get too comfy." The duo exchanged a grin that could have lit up Times Square, then turned to wave at the departing cloud train. A stray comet streaked across the sky, as if the universe itself were sending a postcard. The irony was not lost on them. After all that soaring, they were about to become ground-bound dreamers. Their hearts thumped like drums at a medieval fair, each beat echoing the wonder of a night that smelled of pine sap and distant campfire smoke. Luna's eyelids grew heavy, the kind of weight that feels like a sack of potatoes gently pressed against them. Zephyr's feathers ruffled in the cool breeze, releasing a faint, earthy scent reminiscent of damp soil after rain. Even the insects seemed to hush, their chirps turning into a soft, static lullaby that coaxed the meadow into a sleepy hush. The world, in its grand theatricality, wrapped them in a blanket of moonlit serenity, ready for the inevitable surrender to sleep. As the express settled with a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a contented cat, Luna and Zephyr curled up on the soft, dewy grass. The moon, ever the benevolent night watcher, cast a silver spotlight on their slumbering forms, turning their shadows into dancing silhouettes. A distant howl, perhaps a lone wolf auditioning for a horror movie, added a dramatic flair to the otherwise tranquil tableau. Yet the night held no fear, only the comforting knowledge that tomorrow's adventure would begin with the same curious spark. With a final, gentle breeze kissing their cheeks, they drifted into a peaceful good night, dreaming of clouds that taste like cotton candy and trains that run on starlight. When the lanterns flickered like fireflies tangled in silk, the night market of Chang'an roared with the clamor of sellers hawking pickled lotus roots and dumplings that smelled like a wok-kissed thunderstorm. Li Wei, a caravan driver whose beard could have doubled as a rope, weaved through the chaos, his eyes scanning for a good bargain on camel feed. He bumped into Aisha, a Persian scholar whose curiosity burned brighter than the incense sticks she carried, and she promptly lectured him on the poetry of the Silk Road, while simultaneously stealing a bite of his pork bun. Their banter crackled like a bamboo drum, half scholarly debate, half playful bickering about who could outspice the other. Little did they know that the very cobblestones they stepped on whispered of danger, as if the street itself were a gossip column for the empire's underworld. Soon the market's glitter gave way to the caravan's glitter, an endless river of golden horsehair, lacquered carts, and banners that fluttered like the tails of dragons on a windy day. Li Wei hoisted his crimson banner, announcing the convoy's departure with a shout that startled a nearby goat into a dramatic, yet oddly graceful, somersault. Aisha clutched a stack of scrolls as tightly as a gamer grips a controller, her eyes scanning the horizon for the looming mountains that promised both glory and gumption. Rumors fluttered through the crowd like mischievous sparrows. Ruthless bandits, nicknamed the Scourge of the Steppe, the Silk Road's very own Joker, were said to be prowling the ancient routes. And somewhere, hidden beneath a mound of sand, a jade relic glimmered, its allure as intoxicating as a treasure in a Netflix heist series. As dusk bled into night, the caravan's hooves beat a steady rhythm that echoed like a giant drum circle, vibrating through the dust and into the rider's bones. The scent of roasted lamb mingled with the sour tang of fermented tea, creating an aroma that could make a monk forget his vows and a soldier remember his mother's kitchen. Li Wei, ever the practical joker, slipped a "Beware of the Bandits" sign onto a cart, complete with a cartoonish skull that looked suspiciously like a meme from an ancient scroll. Aisha laughed, her mirth ringing like silver bells, and replied that the only thing scarier than bandits was the prospect of missing the sunrise over the western kingdoms. The convoy rolled forward, a glittering snake swallowing the twilight, while the stars above flickered like audience members waiting for the next act. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of cracked earth that tasted of iron and ancient secrets with each gust of wind that carried whispers of camel sweat and distant prayer chants. Occasionally, a lone desert fox darted across the path, its scream slicing through the night like an out-of-tune violin in a rock concert. Bandit rumors grew louder, as if the shadows themselves were gossiping about the jade relic's sparkle. Some claimed it could turn water into wine, a claim that made Aisha roll her eyes and mutter, "Sure, just like the miracles in those Hollywood blockbusters." Li Wei tightened his grip on the reins, his knuckles whitening, while a stray lantern flickered, casting a dancing silhouette that looked oddly like a superhero cape. The irony was palpable. A caravan of scholars and drivers, armed with scrolls and spiced meat, venturing into a world where the only thing more dangerous than the road was a misplaced sense of self-importance. When the first howl of a distant desert wind brushed against the caravan, a shiver ran through the convoy like a ripple of gossip across a tea house. The night grew thicker, the air heavy with the scent of sandalwood and the faint metallic tang of impending conflict, as if the silk road itself were holding its breath. Li Wei turned to Aisha, offering a grin that said, "If we survive, I'll write a ballad about this adventure that even TikTokers would love," and she replied with a wink, promising to add a footnote about the jade relic's improbable powers. The convoy's lanterns bobbed like fireflies caught in a windstorm, casting elongated shadows that danced on the dunes, hinting at the unseen danger lurking just beyond sight. With a collective sigh that tasted of both excitement and dread, the Midnight Express surged forward, its destiny as uncertain as a plot twist in your favorite binge-watch series. Under a silver moon that hung like a polished coin over the endless Taklamakan, the midnight convoy slipped into the dunes with the grace of a cat burglar in a museum heist. Lanterns sputtered, casting trembling halos that danced on rippling sands, while the camels' hooves whispered secrets to the night. The air smelled of cold stone and distant incense, a reminder that civilization was just a mirage away. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next footstep to break the hush. Without warning, a sandstorm erupted, turning the sky into a furious blender of grit and grit-laden wind. The travelers clutched their scarves, feeling the sand sting their eyes like angry pixies, and the water skins thumped against their hips, each thump a reminder of the dwindling life force within. They huddled beneath a battered caravanserai awning, rationing water sip by sip as if it were the last episode of a binge-watch series. The storm howled like a disgruntled dragon, and every gust seemed to shout, "You thought you were on an epic quest. Well, think again." When the storm finally relented, the sun blazed like a giant furnace set to broil, turning the sand into a searing pan of gold. Sweat slicked the travelers' foreheads, mixing with the salty tang of their own fear, and the camels huffed as if they'd just run a marathon on a treadmill. Tempers flared faster than a TikTok trend, with the spice merchant accusing the silk trader of stealing his water, while the monk muttered prayers that sounded suspiciously like a karaoke rendition of an ancient hymn. The heat pressed down on them, making every word feel like a shout shouted into a megaphone that was stuck on maximum volume. Amid the blistering glare, the whisper of unseen bandits crept through the caravan like a rumor about a celebrity scandal. Every rustle of a dune became a potential ambush, and the guards' eyes darted like squirrels on caffeine. The irony was palpable. They had escaped the perils of city politics only to be haunted by phantom thieves who probably preferred looting camel droppings over gold. Yet the fear kept them moving, because nothing says adventure like a group of weary travelers clutching their water bottles like precious relics from a sci-fi movie. By the time the moon resurfaced, pale and smug, the convoy had settled into a grudging rhythm, each step a compromise between thirst, heat, and the ever-present dread of a nighttime raid. The sand beneath their boots felt like powdered sugar, sweet in its absurdity, while the air carried a faint scent of burnt incense, perhaps the desert's own incense stick. Laughter, ragged and hoarse, broke out when the youngest camel driver suggested they name the stormtrooper after a certain galaxy far-away empire. In that moment, the desert's cruelty and the traveler's camaraderie twirled together, proving that even under a moonlit sandstorm, humanity can find a punchline. Li Wei tightened his boots as the Pamir wind howled like a banshee, slashing at his face with icy needles. The stone-scarred ridge rose before them, a jagged spine of the world that seemed to mock every step. Their caravan trudged through a sea of powdered snow, the scent of yak dung and burning yak butter mingling into a pungent perfume of survival. Each breath fogged the air, and the distant call of a snow-capped eagle reminded them that even the sky was watching. Yet Li Wei's eyes glittered with the same stubborn fire that had driven merchants along the Silk Road for centuries. Just when the group thought the mountain had swallowed them whole, a plume of smoke curled from a hidden valley, announcing a rival caravan. At its helm strutted a merchant named Rashid, whose smile was as sharp as a scimitar, and whose silk wares glittered like a pop star's sequined jacket. Beside him, a monk in a threadbare robe moved like a ghost, his eyes closed but his aura humming with the promise of a secret passage. The two stared each other down across the ridge, the silence between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Li Wei felt the tension coil in his chest, a spring ready to snap. Rashid offered a handshake that smelled faintly of sandalwood and bribery, claiming the secret route could shave days off the journey, if the monk allowed it. The monk, who introduced himself only as Silent One, lifted a weather-worn map and traced a line with a finger as steady as a surgeon's, then said nothing, letting the wind do the talking. Li Wei's men exchanged nervous glances. Some whispered that the monk was a former assassin who now guarded the mountain like a dragon guards its hoard. Humor flickered when one of Li's cooks muttered that the monk's silence was louder than Rashid's bragging, like a mime at a karaoke bar. The air grew colder, and the possibility of betrayal settled like frost on their helmets. Night fell like a black curtain, and the distant howl of wolves sounded suspiciously like a low-budget horror movie soundtrack. Shadows stretched across the ridge, and the faint clink of hidden steel hinted at an ambush waiting to spring like a startled cat. Li Wei ordered the fire to burn brighter, the crackling flames spitting sparks that danced like fireflies on a rave. He whispered to his lieutenants that they must keep their eyes on Rashid's glittering goods and the monk's unmoving stare. Both could be traps wrapped in silk and incense. The smell of melted snow mixed with the acrid bite of gunpowder from a stray cannonball that had somehow survived centuries, reminding everyone that war never truly sleeps. As the first arrows whistled past, Li Wei lunged forward, his sword flashing like a neon lightsaber against the night sky. Rashid's men scrambled, dropping silk bolts that unfurled like bright banners before hitting the ground in a heap of tangled cloth. The Silent One finally opened his mouth, uttering a single word, now, and vanished into the rock, leaving behind a hidden tunnel gaping like a dragon's throat. Li Wei's crew slipped through, the cold stone walls sweating with ancient moisture, while the rival caravan staggered back, bewildered by the sudden turn of events. With the mountains whisper now a roar of triumph, the Midnight Express pressed on, the promise of the Silk Road's secret still glimmering on the horizon. At the stroke of midnight, the ragtag caravan slipped into the shadows of the desert oasis like a secret whispered to the wind. Lanterns flickered, casting amber halos on weather-worn faces as Li Wei and his companions clambered onto the horse-drawn night train, its wheels creaking like an ancient dragon yawning awake. The carriage smelled of burnt incense, spilled goat cheese, and the metallic tang of fresh horse sweat. A lone fiddler plucked a mournful tune that seemed to chase away the desert's howls, while a mischievous grin spread across the driver's beard. He swore the train ran faster than a caffeinated camel. Everyone knew this was no ordinary ride. It was a covert sprint toward destiny, and the night itself held its breath. The iron-clad wheels thundered across the Oxus River's rickety bridge, sending spray of icy water splashing against the lanterns like a chorus of tiny cymbals. Below, the river roared, its frothy mouth swallowing moonlight and the occasional nervous shiver from the travelers. Suddenly, a crackle of whispered rumors reached Li Wei's ears. A band of desert bandits had caught wind of the Jade's hidden location and were hot on their trail. Their torches flickered in the distance, casting grotesque shadows that danced like drunken marionettes on the riverbanks. The air grew thick with the scent of fear, dust, and the faint, sweet perfume of the Jade itself, as if the relic were daring the night to keep its secret. The train lurched forward, its wooden frame rattling like a nervous storyteller, while the bandits surged forward on horseback, hooves pounding the earth with the enthusiasm of a toddler on a sugar rush. Arrows whistled past the carriage windows, nicking the canvas and sending shards of straw fluttering like confetti at a chaotic wedding. Li Wei gripped the Jade's velvet pouch, feeling its cool weight pulse against his palm, as if the stone were a heart beating in time with the chase. A sudden gust of wind carried the scent of burnt pine from a distant campfire, mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder, a reminder that this was no romantic adventure, but a gritty, high-stakes sprint. The driver shouted a half-remembered proverb about patience and pistols, and the train surged into a tunnel of darkness, its whistle echoing like a banshee's laugh. At the tunnel's mouth, the night train screeched to a halt, and the bandits swarmed like locusts, swords glinting under the feeble lantern light. Li Wei stepped forward, the Jade cradled like a mischievous kitten, and faced the leader, a scarred man who looked as if he'd been cast straight out of a gritty Western sequel. The leader demanded the relic, promising a kingdom of gold if Li Wei surrendered. Li Wei, however, felt the Jade's power thrumming, whispering promises of invincibility. With a wry smile, he declared, "I'd rather have my friends alive than a stone that makes me feel like a superhero in a low-budget Marvel flick." In a breath-held moment, he hurled the Jade into the river, watching it sink amid a splash that sounded suspiciously like a collective sigh of relief. The bandits, deprived of their glittering prize, retreated with the dignity of a bad reality TV show finale, leaving the travelers to catch their breath amid the lingering scent of river mud and burnt incense. Li Wei's companions clapped him on the back, half joking that he'd just saved the world from another ancient artifact gone rogue plotline. The night train creaked back to life, its wheels humming a lullaby that reminded everyone that some treasures are better left underwater, like lost socks or forgotten passwords. As the train chugged away, a lone star flickered overhead, winking as if to say, "Nice move, kid." And somewhere downstream, the jade rested in the dark, perhaps plotting its next cameo in a future saga. The first light of dawn painted Samarkand in molten gold, and the weary caravan staggered into its jeweled streets like a troupe of sleep-deprived actors after an all-night improv marathon. Camels huffed clouds of dust that smelled of burnt incense and goat cheese, while the sun's rays bounced off the turquoise domes, turning them into giant, glittering gummy bears. Traders shouted greetings in a chorus of Persian, Turkic, and a few bewildered Greek phrases that sounded like a broken karaoke machine. The men and women, eyes half closed from exhaustion, clutched their packs tighter, feeling the weight of jade stones like cold, stubborn secrets. Even the city's pigeons seemed to gossip, cooing about the arrival as if it were the latest episode of a reality show titled Caravan Wars. At the heart of the bustling bazaar, a troop of scholars gathered around a low table, their robes rustling like ancient scrolls being unrolled. The caravan leader placed the jade smooth, green, and as cool as a superhero's sidekick onto the cloth, and the scholars inhaled its scent, which oddly reminded them of fresh rain on a desert cactus. One elderly professor, with a beard that could hide a small goat, whispered a prayer while his apprentice tried to decipher the carvings, muttering, "If only these symbols came with subtitles." The jade sparked debates louder than a street vendor's bartering chant, each argument punctuated by the clink of teacups and the occasional cough of a camel spit-induced sneeze. Laughter erupted when a young scribe accidentally knocked over a bowl of dates, sending sticky fruit rolling like marbles across the mosaic floor. Friendships blossomed over shared plates of pilaf, and the occasional spilled wine that stained the carpet like abstract art. A Persian merchant and a Chinese silk weaver sealed their pact by swapping a jeweled dagger for a bolt of crimson silk, then high-fiving with gloved hands that squeaked like rubber ducks. The caravan's drummer, whose drumsticks were as worn as his jokes, beat a rhythm that made the stone walls hum, prompting an old storyteller to claim the Midnight Express was actually a time-traveling train from a sci-fi flick. Everyone laughed except the camel named Balthazar, who stared at the drum with a look that said, "I'm not paid enough for this." The night's camaraderie felt as thick as the incense smoke, wrapping the group in a warm, slightly nauseating blanket of unity. As the sun climbed higher, the legends of the Midnight Express began to take on a life of their own, whispered by children who imagined the caravan as a glittering bullet train careening across dunes. Travelers recounted how the jade glowed brighter each time a stranger offered a helping hand, turning the stone into a beacon of hope, much like a smartphone's battery icon at 1% that somehow still manages to survive. The story spread faster than gossip in a royal court, reaching distant towns where bards sang of brave souls who outran sandstorms with the swagger of a superhero landing. Even the city's guards, usually as stern as a tax collector, cracked smiles, admitting they'd secretly hoped the Midnight Express would bring exotic snacks. By sunset, the tale was as entrenched as the city's ancient walls, promising that courage and unity could outlast any empire's rise and fall. When the caravan finally rested, the weary travelers felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy, as if they'd just finished a marathon and were handed a plate of spicy noodles, delicious but with a lingering burn. The air was thick with the aroma of cumin, horse sweat, and a hint of burnt parchment from a scholar's notebook that had seen better days. They exchanged goodbyes that felt like the final chord of a symphony, each note resonating with the promise of future reunions on this endless Silk Road. In the twilight, Samarkand's lanterns flickered like fireflies caught in a jar, casting shadows that danced to the rhythm of distant drums. And so, the Midnight Express rode on, not as a mere train of wagons, but as a living legend that reminded every wanderer that the road itself is the greatest adventure. In the soot-blackened backroom of a Parisian garage, the air tasted of oil and burnt rubber like a cheap espresso gone wrong. Young Eloy Marceau crouched over a tangled skein of wires, his fingertips tingling from the static that seemed to whisper promises of flight. The clang of hammers and the hiss of steam pistons formed a ragged symphony that made his heart thrum louder than a brass band at a village fete. He stared at a cracked photograph of a Wright Flyer, dreaming of soaring as freely as a comet slicing the night. The only thing missing from his imagination was a wing big enough to carry his ambition. Enter Amélie Duval, a whirlwind of ink-stained sketches, and a laugh that could outshine a coal stove's glow. She burst through the workshop door clutching a notebook that smelled of lavender and ambition, demanding to see Eloy's latest contraption. Their banter crackled like sparking wires. She teased him about his tin can, while he retorted that at least his invention didn't need a Wi-Fi password. Over a shared mug of bitter café au lait, she unveiled a design for a winged carriage that looked suspiciously like a dragon on a budget. By the time the steam hissed its final sigh, they were already plotting to chase a dream that would make the Wright brothers look like backyard hobbyists. Rumors began to flutter through the cobblestone alleys like moths attracted to a lantern, whispers of a comet-shaped airship called the Starlight, forged in secret by a guild of early aviators who wore goggles like superhero masks. Some said the vessel glowed with a phosphorescent hull that could be seen from the Eiffel Tower on a moonless night, while others swore it was just a clever hoax cooked up by a tavern barkeep to sell more ale. Amélie, ever the skeptic with a twinkle of mischief, compared the tale to a low-budget Star Wars set, impressive if you squint, impossible if you look too closely. Yet the more they laughed, the more the scent of ozone and adventure seeped into their lungs, stirring a restless curiosity. Eloy felt a strange tug, as if the very ground beneath his boots wanted to lift him toward that celestial silhouette. The year 1903 was a wardrobe of fragile biplanes, each one a patchwork of canvas, spruce, and the kind of optimism that could outshine a rainy Parisian morning. Pilots strapped themselves into wicker-like cages, clinging to control sticks while the wind roared like a disgruntled opera singer demanding an encore. Below, crowds gasped, cheered, and occasionally vomited as the machines wobbled like drunken seagulls over the Seine. Yet every crash, every sputtering engine, only fed the collective yearning to kiss the clouds, as if humanity had finally decided to upgrade from walking to Wi-Fi-enabled flight. In that gritty tableau, Eloy and Amélie saw not just metal and wood, but a ticket to rewrite the rules of gravity. That night, under a flickering gas lamp that sputtered like a nervous actor, the two conspirators spread a crumpled map of France and trace a dotted line toward the rumored launch site. The scent of grease mixed with the sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine, creating a perfume that could only be described as adventure with a side of indigestion. They pledged to chase the starlight, even if it meant swapping their modest tools for a compass that might as well have been drawn by a pirate. Their laughter echoed down the alley, a sound as bright as a brass trumpet announcing a new era. And so, with hearts thudding louder than any engine, they set the first stone of a quest that would carry their names into the annals of sky-bound legend. Eloy and Amélie stepped onto the bustling avenues of the 1909 Grand Exposition, where the air smelled of hot iron, fresh paint, and a faint whiff of triumph. The glass domes reflected a sky crowded with zeppelins and the occasional pigeon that seemed to sneer at the human ambition below. Crowds chattered in a chorus of French, English, and the occasional bewildered German, their voices rising like the steam whistles that punctuated the fairgrounds. Our duo marveled at a gleaming monoplane that looked like a metallic dragonfly, its wings humming a low, promising note. Eloy whispered if Da Vinci could see this, he'd probably ask for a selfie, and Amélie laughed, her eyes sparkling like the polished brass fixtures around them. Inside the grand hall of aeronautical wonders, engineers displayed contraptions that made the audience gasp and the skeptics scoff. A lanky French inventor bragged about a propeller that could spin faster than a tick-tock dance trend, while a stout British rival muttered about a steam-powered glider that smelled faintly of coal and ambition. When Eloy lifted the mysterious starlight crystal, the rival engineer's eyes narrowed, their greed shimmering like cheap foil. Amélie, ever the diplomat, offered a toast with champagne that fizzed like tiny fireworks, only to have the toast interrupted by a sudden, ironic burst of applause for a flying machine shaped like a giant beetle. The clash of egos crackled louder than the nearby generators, setting the stage for a showdown that would make even the most dramatic soap opera blush. Later, tucked beneath a weather-worn pilot's log, Eloy uncovered a cryptic map inked in a trembling hand that smelled of salt and tobacco. The map traced a jagged line to the windswept cliffs of Cornwall, where the sea roared like a crowd of angry fans at a rock concert. Amélie traced the route with a fingertip, noting a tiny sketch of a glider labeled prototype and a warning scribbled in the margin, "Beware the gulls, they steal more than fish." Their curiosity sparked brighter than the lanterns that flickered in the exposition's night, and they boarded a rattling train bound for England, humming an off-key rendition of "Fly Me to the Moon" to keep the mood light. The journey felt like a scene from an old adventure serial, complete with dramatic pauses and exaggerated sighs. Cornwall greeted them with a sky that shifted from buttery gold to bruised violet in a heartbeat, and wind that slapped their faces like an over-enthusiastic fan. The locals, wrapped in woolen shawls and eyeing the strangers with suspicion, muttered about the city folk who think they can tame the sea's breath. A salty spray stung Amélie's eyes, and Eloy's coat fluttered as if trying to take off on its own. They trekked up craggy paths where the ground squelched with mud that smelled of peat and old fish, and a lone lighthouse blinked like a nervous eye in the fog. When a grizzled fisherman finally offered them a ride on his rickety boat, he grumbled that the only thing they'd find up there was a gull's nest and a bad case of seasick vertigo. At the cliff's edge, the sabotaged prototype glider lay half buried in sand, its wooden ribs splintered and its canvas torn like a ripped superhero costume. A hidden spring, rigged by the rival engineers, had snapped the wing just as Eloy tried to lift it, sending a spray of sawdust and pine resin into the wind. The glider lurched, threatening to plunge into the churning surf, and for a heartbeat Amelie's heart thudded louder than the distant surf's roar. With a swift, improvisational fix, duct tape borrowed from a tourist souvenir shop and a prayer whispered in half French, half English, they coaxed the craft back to a tentative balance. As the glider finally caught a gust and rose, wobbling like a nervous teenager on a first date, both adventurers felt a surge of hope that the Starlight's secret might just be worth the bruises, the salty spray, and the occasional gull's snarky theft of their sandwich. Guided by the tattered map, Eloy and Mara stepped onto the hulking deck of the airship Aquila, a floating leviathan of brass and canvas that smelled of oil, hot leather, and yesterday's coffee. The crew, a ragtag band of mustache-sporting engineers, and a captain who swore he'd once outrun a gull, greeted them with a mix of curiosity and the kind of hospitality only found at 10,000 feet. The map's cryptic coordinates pulsed like a promise, hinting that the lost Starlight might be hidden somewhere above the endless Atlantic swath. As the propellers churned, the world fell away, replaced by a quilt of cloud-strewn horizon and the distant call of gulls that sounded like distant Wi-Fi signals. As everyone tightened their harnesses, because in 1919, buckle up meant a rope and a prayer. Halfway across the ocean, the sky turned a bruised violet and the wind snapped like a snapped violin string. Lightning stitched jagged scars across the clouds, each flash illuminating the crew's strained faces and the rusted rivets that clanged in time with the storm's drumbeat. Rain hammered the deck, turning the wooden planks into slippery slides that sent a sack of biscuits flying into the captain's lap, much to his dismay. The Aquila shuddered as a rogue gust slammed into its side, making the gas bags groan like an old accordion on a bad day. Through the roar and the stench of burnt oil, Eloy could hear the faint, mournful wail of the radio, a ghostly Morse code that sounded suspiciously like a 90s power ballad. Fuel gauges flickered like dying fireflies, each dip a reminder that the sky was not an infinite buffet. The chief mechanic, a wiry man named Klaus who claimed he could fix a broken wing with a paperclip, began muttering about rationing, and his mutterings turned into a full-blown mutiny when he suggested dumping the map to save weight. Tension crackled hotter than the lightning outside, and a lanky navigator slammed his fist on the control wheel, shouting that they'd rather crash into a dolphin than hand over the parchment. Mara, ever the diplomat, tried to calm the crew with a joke about stormtrooper training, but the joke fell flat as the ship lurched, sending a tray of steaming soup spilling onto the floor. The air grew thick with the smell of hot metal, wet wool, and a hint of panic that tasted like burnt toast. Just as the mutineers were about to seize the helm, Eloy's boot kicked a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment that smelled of mildew and old ink. Inside lay a rolled fragment of the Starlight's original blueprint, its edges frayed like an ancient scroll, and its lines glowing faintly under the storm's intermittent lightning. The paper crackled as he unrolled it, showing a schematic of a mysterious engine chamber that no one had ever seen on the Aquila. The crew froze, eyes wide, as the captain whispered, "That's the missing piece, or a recipe for disaster." Eloy felt a shiver run down his spine, half from the cold wind and half from the realization that the treasure they chased might be a Pandora's box. With the blueprint in hand, the captain ordered a daring maneuver. They would ride the eye of the storm like a surfer on a cosmic wave, hoping the gusts would push them toward the hidden coordinates. The Aquila plunged into the calm center, the rain turning into a fine mist that smelled like sea-salted metal, while the crew, now united by the promise of discovery, cheered louder than a 1920s jazz band. As they emerged on the other side, the clouds peeled away to reveal a glimmering speck on the horizon, perhaps the Starlight's ghost, or maybe just a rogue buoy, but the map's line trembled in anticipation. Eloy tucked the blueprint into his coat, feeling the weight of history press against his heart like a stubborn seatbelt. And so, with thunder still echoing behind them, the Aquila sailed onward, the storm over the Atlantic becoming a legend they'd tell future generations over campfires, and inevitably, in a few too many exaggerated podcasts. The gale finally loosened its grip, and the battered canvas of the Zephyr Roman II shuddered as it rolled out of the black maw of the storm. Through the dripping haze, Eloy squinted and saw a faint, luminous silhouette perched on the horizon like a ghostly lighthouse that had lost its power. The shape was an island, but not the sun-kissed paradise of postcards. It lay cloaked in perpetual twilight, where the sky bled indigo and the air smelled of wet moss and old engine oil. Yamili's heart thumped like a piston, half exhilarated, half terrified, as the crew whispered that they'd stumbled upon the legendary Starlight. With a creak that sounded suspiciously like a tired cat stretching, the ship's rudder nudged toward the mysterious shore, and the crew braced for whatever waited in the half-light. The island's coastline was a jagged scar of black basalt, dotted with phosphorescent lichens that glowed like the afterglow of a cheap neon sign. At its center rose the Starlight itself, a hulking aeronautical relic whose alloy skin was etched with constellations that seemed to shift when you weren't looking, like a cosmic tattoo that refused to stay still. The hull shimmered with a metallic sheen that caught the dim stars and threw them back into the sky, bathing the beach in a silvery rain that made the sand feel like powdered sugar on a sweaty foot. A faint metallic tang of ozone mingled with the sour scent of seaweed, while distant gulls cackled like old pilots complaining about runway delays. Even the wind seemed to sigh in admiration, as if the island itself were a retired movie set waiting for the next blockbuster. Only this time, the heroes were armed with wrenches, not lightsabers. No sooner had they set foot on the sand than a plume of black smoke announced the arrival of the rival guild, the Sky Ravens, who strutted in like a gang of 1920s gangsters with brass knuckles made of copper wire. Their captain, a flamboyant daredevil named Jasper, Jet Jester Malone, tipped his leather cap and declared they'd claim the Starlight before the crew could even find the ignition key. Eloy and Amelie exchanged a glance that said "Game on," and sprinted toward the engine hatch, their boots kicking up gritty sand that stuck to their sweaty forearms. The engine's heart was sealed behind a puzzle panel that demanded knowledge of early aerodynamics, lift, drag, and the subtle art of wing warping, a technique the Wright brothers invented by literally twisting their wings like a toddler's paper airplane. Beside the mechanical riddles lay a star chart etched in an ancient guild script, forcing the duo to navigate using celestial cues that would make a modern GPS blush with envy. With a triumphant grin, Amélie aligned the brass compass rose to the North Star, while Eloy adjusted the wing warping levers, feeling the cold metal bite into his fingertips like a stubborn burr. The final lock clicked, and a low hum rose from the engine, a sound like 1,000 bees humming a lullaby for a sleeping dragon. They threw the ignition switch, and the Starlight's heart roared to life, spitting flames that painted the twilight in orange and gold, while the island's perpetual dusk seemed to gasp in surprise. The massive craft shuddered, lifted, and with a thunderous sigh that rattled the nearby cliffs, rose into the night, its hull scattering starlight like confetti at a New Year's party. As the Starlight ascended, a brilliant beacon burst from its prow, carving a luminous arrow across the heavens, a signal that would make even the most seasoned lighthouse keeper weep with pride. The sky ravens, caught mid-cheer, stumbled backward, their polished boots slipping on the now wet sand as they muttered curses that sounded suspiciously like bad karaoke lyrics. Eloy clapped Amélie on the back, their faces smeared with grease and triumph, and declared that they'd just rewritten the textbook on how to steal a ship with style. Below, the island's twisted trees swayed, shedding a few dead leaves that fluttered like confetti, while the salty wind carried the faint smell of burnt fuel and fresh possibility. The crew gathered on the deck, eyes fixed on the glowing trail behind them, feeling the hum of the engine reverberate through their bones like a drumbeat in an epic space opera. And as the Starlight vanished into the star-strewn night, a lone gull perched on the mast and let out a squawk that sounded oddly like a sarcastic, "Well, that's one way to get a lift," sealing the tale with a wink from the heavens. The Starlight touched down on the rust-spotted runway of Le Bourget like a tired cat, its silver ribs humming a lullaby of starlight. Eloy leapt from the cockpit, his boots kicking up a cloud of soot and fresh-cut hay that smelled like a summer market. Amélie followed, clutching a battered notebook whose pages were stained with engine oil and the occasional coffee ring, proof that genius rarely travels clean. A crowd of bewildered townsfolk gathered, their gaslights flickering as if trying to applaud, while a skeptical farmer muttered that the machine looked more like a giant beetle than a bird. Yet when the winglets caught the evening breeze and the propellers sighed, even the old watchmaker whispered, "It's like watching a comet land in a haystack." That night, under a canvas of lanterns, Eloy and Amélie unveiled the Starlight's secret, a lattice of crystal-coated ribs that drank starlight and spat it out as lift. They demonstrated the principle by tossing a handful of glittering dust into the air, which glowed brighter than a disco ball at a 1970s dance-off. The engineers in the back squinted, then erupted in cheers, their faces lit by the soft blue glow, as if they'd just discovered the cheat code for gravity. A skeptical journalist tried to compare it to magical realism, but Amélie snapped, "It's not magic, it's physics with a sense of humor. Think Back to the Future meets a French bistro." By midnight, the design sketches were copied onto napkins, tavern walls, and the back of a pizza box, spreading faster than gossip about a royal scandal. The next morning, a gaggle of eager youngsters gathered at the airfield, their eyes wide as saucers and their pockets full of stale baguettes for fuel. Just kidding, they brought notebooks and daring. Eloy let the Starlight's gentle ascent whisper its story, each lift off a slow, graceful rise like a ballerina pirouetting on moonbeams. The apprentices felt the vibration through their boots, a ticklish buzz that reminded them of a phone on silent mode, subtle but impossible to ignore. One kid shouted, "If this thing can ride the stars, can it also deliver pizza?" And the crowd erupted in laughter, the sound ricocheting off the hangar like a slapstick symphony. By sunset, the airfield resembled a schoolyard of dreamers, each promising to trade their mundane chores for a seat beside the stars, a promise as bold as a knight swapping armor for a skateboard. Word of the starlight spread beyond France, hitchhiking on telegrams, carrier pigeons, and the occasional meme-like sketch of a bird with a propeller hat. Governments, previously content to keep their pilots grounded, now drafted new statutes that required every citizen to attend at least one Skywatch lecture, because who wouldn't want to learn how to dodge meteors on a Tuesday? The irony was palpable. The same people who once scoffed at hot air balloons now lined up to fund star fuel research, as if they'd suddenly discovered that the sky was a free-range buffet. In cafes, philosophers debated whether humanity was finally catching up to the gods or merely borrowing their Wi-Fi, while a street performer sang a jaunty tune about flying on borrowed light. Yet beneath the jokes, a serious current ran deep, a collective pulse that said, "We will not be satisfied with merely touching clouds. We will chase the sunrise itself." As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the horizon, Eloy and Amélie slipped away to a quiet hill crowned with wildflowers that smelled like wet earth and old laundry. They spread a blanket, the fabric rustling like a nervous audience, and watched the sun climb, its gold spilling over the world like melted butter on toast. The starlight rested in the distance, its hull glinting, a silent promise that the adventure was far from over. Amélie whispered, "We've only written the prologue. The sequel will have us dancing with comets." And Eloy laughed, his breath forming a tiny cloud that vanished as quickly as a TikTok trend. With the horizon ablaze and the wind humming a lullaby of future flights, they felt the same exhilaration that first sparked their quest, a feeling that, like a well-timed punchline, would never grow old. The sun cracked open the dreamtime like an overcooked egg, spilling gold across the endless whispering plains. Dust rose in lazy spirals, tasting of sage and horse sweat, while the wind carried the faint clink of distant metal, an impossible sound on a horizon of grasses. Nomads sprawled in teepee-like shelters, their fire smoke curling like lazy dragons that refused to breathe fire. Even the tumbleweeds seemed to pause, listening for a rhythm that none of them remembered hearing before. The plains, usually a silent stage, now hummed with a promise that made the ground tremble like a nervous teenager's first dance. At the heart of the camp, Chief Arrowhand stood tall, his feather-crowned head glinting like a Wi-Fi router in a storm, always searching for a signal. Beside him, his sister Shaman Lyra traced the ancient runes on her drumskin, coaxing a low, metallic chant that rose above the gulls' gossip. The song was a rust-ed lullaby of wheels turning, of iron teeth grinding against stone, a melody that whispered of a carriage that could stitch together the far-flung corners of the world. Lyra's eyes flashed with the colors of sunrise, and she claimed the vision was a gift from the dreaming mother, not a prank from mischievous sprites. Arrowhand felt the hair on his arms stand up, as if the very air were trying to pull his beard into a knot. The council gathered around a fire that crackled like an old cassette player stuck on rewind, each elder puffing on a pipe that smelled of burnt sage and stale goat cheese. Old Macora scoffed, "A carriage. What do we expect it to deliver pizza across the desert? Younger hunters laughed, imagining a metal beast that could outrun a cheetah and still have room for a family road trip playlist. Yet the youngest, a spry girl named Tico, whispered that the iron song might be the only thing strong enough to pull the sky carvers out of their endless wandering. The debate swirled like dust devils, half reverent, half ridiculous, each argument punctuated by the occasional grunt that sounded suspiciously like a distant train horn. When the fire finally dimmed, Arrowhand raised his hand, silencing the chatter like a conductor stopping a runaway orchestra. He declared that they would follow the song, building a path of stone and steel that could carry their stories farther than any eagle's flight. Lyra nodded, her drumbeat now a steady thrum, promising to bind the tribe's fate to the iron carriage's heartbeat. The council erupted in cheers and curses, some slapping each other's backs, others muttering about the inevitable mud that would soak their boots. With a grin as wide as the prairie, Arrowhand whispered, "Let's make a railroad so legendary, even the gods will need a GPS." As dawn's amber light stretched, the tribe packed their belongings, leather bags stuffed with dried jerky, cracked gourds of fermented milk, and a suspiciously large sack of popcorn for morale. They set out, their footprints sinking into the soft earth, leaving behind a trail that smelled of sweat, pine resin, and the faint metallic tang of destiny. The whispering plains seemed to sigh, as if aware that the next few months would be filled with clanging rails, roaring steam, and the occasional cowboy-like showdown with a rogue tumbleweed. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the iron carriage waited, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like the opening theme of a space opera, because every great journey needs a soundtrack. And so the Sky Carvers began their quest, their laughter echoing across the continent, promising that when the rails finally linked east to west, even the Dreamtime would have to upgrade its Wi-Fi. Arrowhand slung his weather-worn pack over his shoulder, while Lyra tightened the straps on her copper-tipped boots, and the two set off toward the western horizon like a pair of reluctant tourists on a reality show road trip. The sunrise painted the plains in bruised oranges, and the wind carried the faint, sour scent of burnt sage that made Lyra's nose twitch. They sang an old caravan chant, half-heartedly, because the only thing louder than their voices was the rumble of distant thunderheads. Every step kicked up dust that stuck to their skin like a stubborn, glittery tattoo, reminding them that the journey was as gritty as a desert bar fight. Even the crows overhead seemed to cackle at their ambition, as if the sky itself were a sarcastic commentator on their quest for the iron carriage. Soon the duo ran into the Red Fang clan, a band of fierce warriors who guarded the canyon like bouncers at a nightclub with a strict no outside food policy. The clash began with a chorus of war cries and the sharp clang of steel against stone, echoing off the cliffs like an over-enthusiastic rock concert. Arrowhand's blade sang a bright, metallic note that sliced through the air, while Lyra's spear whistled, leaving a thin line of copper-red smoke that smelled like burnt incense and cheap fireworks. The rival chief, a hulking man with a scar shaped like a lightning bolt, demanded tribute in the form of dried meat and a promise never to return, an offer as welcome as a cold shower in a desert. After a tense standoff, they brokered a shaky truce, swapping stories over a pot of sour milk that tasted suspiciously like regret. The mountains that rose ahead were jagged enough to make a dentist wince, their peaks capped with snow that glittered like powdered sugar on a donut. Lyra slipped on a patch of ice, sending a spray of frosty crystals into her face, and the bitter bite of cold made her teeth chatter louder than a nervous crowd at a pop star's surprise appearance. Arrowhand hacked a path with his axe, each swing sending splinters flying like confetti at a chaotic parade, while the wind howled through the ravines, sounding oddly like a chorus of distant car horns. They navigated narrow ledges, where a single misstep would send them plummeting into a canyon that smelled of damp rock and ancient secrets. By night, they huddled in a cave that reeked of bat guano, sharing a meager stew that tasted like mud wrapped in regret, yet the stars above shone bright enough to make even the most hardened prospector feel like a kid at a fireworks show. When they finally crested the ridge, the glittering spires of new dawn greeted them like a neon lit set from a cyberpunk flick, except the neon was replaced by soot, and the flick was a dusty documentary about overworked engineers. The city's chief engineer, a wiry man with a monocle that looked like a broken magnifying glass, greeted them with a grin as thin as a railway tie, demanding gold and labor before he would part with the coveted blueprints. "Gold," Arrowhand laughed. "We thought you wanted coffee, not a treasure hunt." Lyra rolled her eyes, noting that the smell of oil and hot metal wafting from the workshop was more intoxicating than any perfume. After a heated barter that smelled of sweat, rust, and a hint of burnt popcorn, the engineers finally handed over a rolled parchment, warning that the iron carriage would chew up any soul foolish enough to ignore its temperamental spirit. That night, as they camped on the outskirts of the city, the Dreamtime spirits materialized in flickering firelight, their forms shifting between ancient kangaroos and rusted rail spikes. They showed Arrowhand and Lyra a nightmarish vision of broken rails snaking through the desert like a wounded snake, its metallic hiss mingling with the cries of lost travelers. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and iron, making Lyra's throat feel like she'd swallowed a handful of gravel. Yet the spirits also whispered of a future where the iron carriage would bind the continent together, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like the opening riff of a classic rock anthem. With a grim chuckle, Arrowhand tightened his grip on his axe. Lyra flexed her fingers around her spear, and they vowed to lay those tracks, even if the ghosts of broken rails tried to trip them up along the way. The convoy thundered into the roaring river of steel, a canyon so wide the sun seemed to drown in its metallic glare. Steel girders jutted like the teeth of a giant, half-eaten beast, and the clang of hammers echoed like a rock concert in a canyon bar. Engineers in soot-stained caps shouted measurements, their voices bouncing off the river's iron-kissed cliffs. Arrowhand, perched on a makeshift platform, felt the wind slap his face like a slapstick comedy punchline, reminding him that this was no polite promenade. The river below churned with the sound of 1,000 train wheels that hadn't been built yet, promising both destiny and disaster. With the first rails hammered into the riverbank, the crew began the audacious task of spanning the watery chasm, their scaffolding swaying like a nervous tightrope walker. Suddenly, dark clouds rolled in, and the sky opened up, dumping a torrent that turned the river into a frothing beast. The half-built bridge snapped under the surge, sending timber and steel crashing into the water with a splash that smelled of rust and river mud. Workers shouted, some in panic, others in disbelief, as the floodwaters swallowed their hard-won progress like a hungry teenager devouring pizza. The roar of the water drowned out all jokes. leaving a bitter aftertaste of defeat on everyone's lips. Arrowhand stood amid the wreckage, his eyes scanning the angry faces of the rival tribes and the soot-covered city laborers. He raised his voice, louder than the flood's echo, demanding they set aside ancient grudges and work together, promising a share of the wealth that would flow once the tracks sang. The tribal chiefs, still wearing feathered war paint, exchanged wary glances, while the city foreman muttered about overtime pay and broken coffee mugs. Humor cracked the tension when a burly worker slipped on mud, landing with a theatrical thud that earned a chorus of groans and a reluctant chuckle. Slowly, grudging nods turned into tentative handshakes, each side realizing that rebuilding the bridge was the only way to keep their families from becoming riverbed souvenirs. Just as the uneasy coalition began moving timber, a scream cut through the clamor. A sabotaged bolt had been loosened, sending a section of the new scaffold crashing into the river with a metallic scream. Fingers pointed, accusations flew faster than a bullet train, and Arrowhand's gut twisted with suspicion. The culprit turned out to be a disgruntled apprentice, his eyes darting like a nervous squirrel, claiming he'd been promised a promotion that never arrived, his bitterness as palpable as the river's cold spray. The revelation sparked a mix of outrage and dark comedy. One foreman whispered, "Well, at least he's finally making a splash in history," eliciting nervous laughter. The saboteur was hauled away, his fate sealed like a train car at the end of the line, while the rest of the crew swore to double-check every bolt, nut, and gossip rumor. Rebuilding began at dawn, the sun casting a golden sheen over the twisted steel, turning the wreckage into a glittering obstacle course. Tribesmen wielded hammers with the grace of drummers, while city workers coordinated like a marching band, their shouts forming a rhythm that echoed through the canyon. The air filled with the smell of hot metal, fresh pine, and the occasional whiff of burnt coffee, proof that civilization was still alive. By sunset, a new bridge rose, shaky but sturdy, a testament to the odd fellowship forged in mud, sweat, and irony. As the first locomotive hissed its approval, Arrowhand smiled, knowing the river of iron had finally become a river of hope, and that even the most stubborn saboteur couldn't derail the dream. The sun had finally set behind the rust-red dunes, leaving the newly restored bridge to glint like a silver tooth in the moonlight. Engineers and dream weavers alike gathered at the edge of the desert, their boots kicking up clouds of sand that smelled of ozone and old campfire ash. With the bridge humming under the weight of hope, the last length of rail, gleaming as a fresh fish scale, snaked across the barren plain. Workers tightened bolts with a rhythm that matched the distant howl of a coyote, as if the wild were keeping time with their ambition. Even the desert scorpions seemed to pause, their pincers clicking in anticipation of what was to come. As the constellations aligned like a cosmic crossword, Lyra stood on the highest rail, her cloak fluttering like a flag at a rock concert. She whispered to the Dreamtime spirits, her voice a mix of ancient chant and a badly tuned karaoke version of Bohemian Rhapsody. The night air crackled, tasting of iron and jasmine, and the stars winked conspiratorially, as if the universe had just been handed a backstage pass. With each syllable, the spirits swirled visible ribbons of light that tangled around the tracks, humming a lullaby older than the desert itself. The crowd felt a shiver run up their spines, half reverent, half like the first bite of a ghost pepper. Then the iron carriage emerged from the shadows, its polished hull reflecting the sky like a giant, humming beetle. It rolled onto the freshly laid rails with a sound that was part thunder, part vintage train whistle, and part a cat purring in a bathtub. The scent of hot metal mingled with the sweet perfume of desert night-blooming flowers, making the onlookers' noses dance. Inside, the seats glowed with an ethereal blue, as if the Dreamtime had installed mood lighting for dramatic effect. Even the sand seemed to bow, scattering tiny pearls of dust that glittered like confetti at a superhero movie premiere. Just as the carriage settled into a steady hum, a shadow slithered from the dunes, Sabra, the saboteur, wielding a sack of dynamite that smelled like burnt popcorn. He hurled the explosives onto the tracks, shouting, "You can't railroad a revolution." With the gusto of a villain in a Saturday morning cartoon, the dynamite sputtered, spat, and then fizzed out, its fuse snuffed by a sudden gust of wind that smelled like stale beer. Lyra, quick as a jackrabbit on espresso, grabbed a glowing spirit rope and yanked the carriage forward, the metal screeching like a cat on a vinyl record. The crowd gasped as the carriage's wheels spun, crushing the sabotaged section and sending a spray of sand and sparks into the night, turning the showdown into a fireworks display no one had paid for. When the last spark faded, the desert fell silent, save for the carriage's low purr, now steady as a contented dragon. Sabra, defeated but oddly impressed, slumped to the sand, muttering something about "next time I'll bring better fireworks." Lyra raised her arms, and the Dreamtime spirits rose like neon ribbons, stitching the fractured unity back together with threads of laughter and resolve. The crew cheered, their voices echoing across the dunes like an old Western chorus, while the smell of diesel mingled with fresh rain that had never fallen here before. And so the Dreamtime carriage rose, its journey across the continent promising more legends, more mishaps, and perhaps a cameo from a certain time-traveling doctor. When the last iron wheel clanged against the granite tie, the Dreamtime carriage rolled to a halt on the prairie, its paint dulled by dust and its lanterns flickering like fireflies in a windstorm. A chorus of steam hisses rose from the engines, mingling with the scent of coal, fresh pine, and the sour tang of sweat from the workers who'd hauled steel across rivers and canyons. The sun sank low, painting the sky in bruised purples as the eastern horizon finally touched the western cliffs, a seam of light that looked like a cosmic zip line. Onlookers from the plains to the mountains cheered, their voices cracking like cracked pottery, and even a lone coyote howled a note that seemed to applaud the feat. That night the Dreamtime song, once a lilting chant whispered around campfires, burst into a living legend, its melody swelling like a locomotive's whistle across the valley. Children chased the echo, their bare feet slapping the dusty ground, while elders swayed, eyes closed, feeling the rhythm pulse through their veins like fresh blood in a marathon runner. The song grew legs, sprouting verses about iron horses, steel bridges, and the stubborn optimism of those who dared to stitch a continent together. Even the river, usually a lazy gossip, roared a bass line that made the reeds dance in syncopated applause. Arrowhand, now sporting a battered hat that had seen more sunrise than a sitcom rerun, stood beside Lyra, whose braid was tangled with bits of copper wire and wildflowers, a fashion statement no runway would dare copy. Together they raised a flag stitched from scraps of native fabrics and railroad canvas, its colors clashing like a 90s neon shirt at a Victorian tea party. Traders from the east unloaded crates of spices that smelled like adventure, while Western artisans displayed beadwork that glittered like starlight on a train window. Laughter bubbled over mugs of fermented cactus juice, and someone slipped on a stray oat sack, turning a dignified speech into an impromptu slapstick routine that left the crowd in stitches, literally and figuratively. As the revelry faded into a soft hum, the ancient spirits, those whispering winds that once guided the first hunters, sidled up to the fire and murmured, "The true carriage isn't steel. It's the bond you forged in sweat and song." Their voices tasted of rain on desert sand and the metallic bite of fresh-cut rails, reminding everyone that the tracks were merely the ribs, not the heart. Arrowhand chuckled, noting the irony that a machine built to conquer distance had instead taught the peoples to bridge their differences. The night air grew thick with incense and the faint smell of burnt pine, a fragrant reminder that legends are as much about feeling as they are about fact. When dawn cracked like an overcooked egg, the new era of trade and communion marched forward, carts humming, horses snorting, and drones. Yes, the future's cheeky little buzzers, hovering overhead, filming the spectacle for anyone with a Wi-Fi signal. The Dreamtime carriage, now a mythic backdrop, stood rusted but proud, its silhouette etched against a sky that seemed to say, "We did it, folks, and we didn't even need a time machine." The spirits, satisfied, slipped back into the wind, leaving behind a lingering scent of fresh ink and possibility. And so the continent sang, laughed, and built on, sealing the railroad's legacy with every footstep, every freight car, and every story told around the next fire. In the fog-cloaked valleys of 18th-century France, the air tasted of damp moss and the faint sting of coal smoke from distant forges. Etienne Leclerc, a lanky alchemist with ink-stained fingertips, leaned over a cracked pewter mug while his sister Amélie, fierce-eyed and never one to shy from a soot-caked apron, listened to tavern gossip about a mysterious fire-filled globe that could rise without wings. The rumor crackled like a nervous spark, promising a sky-born carriage that would lift mortals beyond the reach of the king's taxes. Their curiosity ignited faster than a candle in a windstorm, and the siblings swore on a cracked rosary to chase the impossible. The next morning they rounded up a motley crew, a carpenter who could whittle a chair faster than a gossip could spread, a tinker who smelled perpetually of oil and burnt cheese, and a retired circus rope walker who claimed he could balance on a thread of air. Amélie handed out ragged sketches like flyers for a rock concert, and Etienne whispered grandiose equations that sounded more like poetry than physics. The group laughed at the absurdity. "We'll be the first humans to Netflix in the clouds," while the village dogs barked at the clatter of tools and the occasional burst of laughter. Yet beneath the jokes, a gritty determination settled like dust on the workshop floor. With parchment maps spread across a creaking table, Etienne traced the invisible rivers of wind that curled over the hills, noting where the breezes whispered sweetly and where they howled like a banshee. Amélie, ever the pragmatist, marked the scent of wet earth after rain and the metallic tang of lightning, insisting that a successful ascent required more than theory. It needed the nose of a seasoned hunter. The artisans debated the best fabric, finally settling on a coarse linen that smelled of hay and horse sweat, sturdy enough to hold the fiery heart they planned to hoist. Their charts grew speckled with coffee stains and the occasional doodle of a dragon, a reminder that ambition often rides on the back of imagination. Construction began in a barn that reeked of horse manure, rust, and the sweet perfume of fresh pine shavings. The carpenter hammered wooden ribs together, each strike echoing like a drumbeat for an unseen parade, while the tinker rigged a network of copper tubes that hissed and sputtered, releasing a faint odor of burnt sugar. Emily supervised the stitching of the envelope, her hands slick with sweat and the occasional splatter of pitch, muttering, "If this doesn't lift us, at least it'll make a fine pancake." Etienne poured a concoction of heated air and a dash of alchemical secret, watching the globe bulge and tremble as if it were about to burst into a fireworks show. By dusk, the balloon hung like a swollen, smoky jellyfish, ready to defy gravity and the village's skepticism. When the sun slipped behind the hills, casting the valley in amber, the crew gathered on the barn's cracked stone steps, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the balloon's fire-filled belly. A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd as Etienne declared, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to become the original Up, no Pixar required." The wind sighed, lifting the envelope gently, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to hold its breath, smelling of hot metal, pine, and the faint promise of adventure. As the balloon swayed and then rose, the siblings exchanged a triumphant grin, their dreams finally taking flight beyond the Earth's grasp, leaving the valley below to wonder whether the sky had just gotten a little more crowded. When the first sunrise brushed the cobblestones of St. Malo, Etienne and Amélie had already hoisted the skeletal ribs of their balloon like a giant, rust-caked skeleton waiting for flesh. The townspeople gathered with half-filled mugs, their breath fogging the crisp air as they muttered about flying contraptions and madmen. The smell of hot tar and fresh pine shavings mingled with the distant clatter of the market, a sensory reminder that progress often smells like a blacksmith's shop after a long night. Skeptics scoffed, comparing the project to a child's kite caught in a hurricane, while the duo hammered away, their calloused hands slick with sweat. Yet every thud of the mallet echoed a promise that the sky might soon feel a little more like home. Across the square, the jealous tinker Monsieur Bouchard spread rumors faster than a gossiping sparrow, insisting the balloon would burst like a cheap party popper. He hired a band of mischievous youths to loosen the rope knots, their giggles echoing like a badly dubbed cartoon soundtrack. When a stray cat knocked over a barrel of pitch, the resulting sticky mess seeped into the fabric, prompting Etienne to curse in a tone that would make a sailor blush. The rival inventors, armed with pamphlets that read, "Don't let your children become human fireworks," staged a mock trial in the tavern, serving ale in cups shaped like tiny balloons. Their sabotage was as clumsy as a medieval tick-tock dance, but it added a dramatic flair that would make even Shakespeare roll his eyes. Just as the canvas was being unfurled, the sky cracked open with a sudden, angry storm that smelled of ozone and damp earth, rattling the shutters of every nearby shop. Dark clouds rolled in like a troupe of angry theater critics, hissing and snapping at the fragile envelope with wind that smelled faintly of wet wool. Etienne realized the ordinary linen would tear at the first gust, so they scrambled for a rare silk-treated canvas whispered about in the merchant's back alley, its fibers woven with a sheen that caught the lightning like a disco ball. The silk arrived in a cracked wooden crate, its surface slick with a faint perfume of lavender and oil, promising both strength and a touch of elegance. As the wind howled, the duo wrestled the heavy fabric into place, each stitch a battle against nature's relentless applause. Undeterred, the pair set to work on the burner, a hulking brass beast that hissed and spat fire like a dragon with a bad cold. They melted copper coils over a bed of coal, the acrid scent of burning soot filling their nostrils and making Amélie's eyes water like a toddler after a lemon. Etienne, ever the showman, added a copper whistle that sang a high-pitched note each time the flame roared, a tiny nod to the steam engines of the future. When the final spark ignited, the burner belched a warm orange glow, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding rooftops and making the onlookers squint as if they'd just watched a sunrise in a cinema. The heat radiated like a giant, comforting hand, convincing even the most skeptical farmer that the contraption might indeed lift off without turning into a flaming meatball. On the day of the ascent, the townsfolk gathered like a crowd at a medieval rock concert, clutching cheese wheels and wooden cups, their faces a mixture of awe and dread. Etienne gave a theatrical speech, comparing the balloon to a giant, floating soufflé, light, airy, and prone to collapse if overmixed, eliciting nervous chuckles that quickly turned into nervous applause. As the envelope swelled and the burner roared, a gust of wind lifted the craft, and for a heartbeat the whole village seemed to hold its breath, the scent of burnt coal mingling with the sweet perfume of the silk canvas. The balloon rose, wobbling like a newborn giraffe, but held steady, its shadow sliding over the rooftops like a mischievous cloud. When they finally touched down, the crowd erupted in cheers louder than a tavern brawl, and even Bouchard muttered, "Well, I guess they finally found the cheat code for the sky." The morning air smelled of damp straw and horse sweat as the pioneers hauled the clumsy sack of canvas toward the riverbank. When they finally released the tether, the balloon lurched like a startled goose, wobbling on a gust that seemed to have a mind of its own. Jacques, the chief tinkerer, shouted over the roar of the burner, his voice cracking like a vinyl record in a storm. The flame sputtered, coughed, and then flared, painting the sky a furious orange that made the onlookers gasp in equal parts awe and terror. By the time the basket steadied, everyone was drenched in goose-egg rain and pride, wondering if they'd just invented a new form of airborne slapstick. The river below glistened like a giant mirror, but the balloon's erratic drift turned it into a slippery slide of doom. A sudden gust shoved the craft toward the water, and the basket tipped, sending a sack of coal spilling into the current with a splash that sounded like a cannonball hitting a bathtub. Marie, clutching the rope, let out a scream that could have been a banshee or a particularly enthusiastic opera singer, hard to tell over the crackling fire. The balloon skimmed the surface, water lapping at the bottom like an impatient cat, before the wind mercifully nudged it back into the sky. They all breathed a sigh of relief that tasted of river mud and burnt rope, promising never to trust a calm river again. Night fell as quickly as a magician's curtain, and the pioneers found themselves drifting over a moonlit meadow that smelled of wild thyme and cow manure. The burner, now a tired dragon, coughed out a feeble glow, casting long shadows that danced like jittery silhouettes from an old silent film. When the wind finally gave up, the balloon settled with a gentle thud onto a patch of dewy grass, the basket swaying like a cradle in a nursery. Frost nipped at their cheeks, and the only soundtrack was the distant croak of frogs and the occasional owl hoot that sounded suspiciously like a sarcastic applause. Huddled together, they shivered, half laughing, half cursing the night for being as unpredictable as a reality TV plot twist. By sunrise, the crew had turned each mishap into a lesson, scribbling frantic notes on soggy parchment about how to read the wind's fickle moods. Jacques learned that a steady flame required the right balance of coal and breath, like a barista perfecting a latte foam. Too much heat and you scorch, too little and the balloon sighs. Marie discovered that trusting a teammate's instinct was more reliable than any compass, especially when the sky decided to play a game of hide and seek with the clouds. They began to treat the wind as a mischievous partner rather than a hostile foe, offering it a polite please before each ascent. Their humor grew, too. They started calling the balloon the floating pantry, because it always seemed to carry a surprise cargo of soot and soggy blankets. When the final test ended with a smooth glide back to the launch field, the pioneers felt like the 1800s version of the Avengers, minus the capes but plus a lot more soot. The crowd erupted in cheers that sounded like a chorus of cicadas on a hot summer night, and the air was thick with the sweet scent of victory and freshly baked bread from a nearby stall. The balloon, now a seasoned veteran, bobbed gently in the wind as if winking at the onlookers, promising more adventures above the clouds. Their story spread like wildfire, inspiring tavern talk and daring bets about who would next brave the sky. And so, with wind in their hair and fire in their hearts, they set their sights on the horizon, ready to chase the next gust of destiny. As the sun slipped behind the ragged silhouette of the hill, a hush settled over the throng gathered at the launch site. Lanterns flickered like fireflies, casting trembling gold on the weathered faces of farmers, poets, and a few skeptical aristocrats who'd heard rumors of a sky-borne carriage. There, tethered to a sturdy oak, the balloon, affectionately christened El-Aurore, gleamed in the dimming light, its envelope a patchwork of canvas and daring ambition. The crowd collectively held its breath, the kind of breath that smells faintly of spilled cider and anticipation. When the burner roared to life, a plume of orange-kissed smoke rose, announcing the moment humanity would try to outclimb twilight itself. The basket shuddered as the first gust of wind nudged it upward, and the riders felt the earth's grip loosen like a reluctant lover letting go. Below, the hill rolled away, a quilt of fields and cottages turning into a miniature model town, the scent of fresh hay and distant wood smoke rising to meet them. The balloon's envelope swelled, humming with the heat of the fire, while the crowd's cheers turned into a distant murmur, as if the world were being muffled by a giant blanket. Above, the sky deepened from pastel pink to bruised indigo, and the first stars blinked awake, winking at the audacious craft. El-Aurore seemed to glide on a river of air, its canvas catching the last sighs of daylight. Just as the balloon pierced the twilight veil, a sudden gale slammed into its side, a mischievous wind that felt like a dragon's breath on the back of the neck. The canvas flapped wildly, the basket rattled, and a few loose straps sang a metallic screech that could rival a screeching cat on a hot tin roof. The pilot's cheeks flushed with effort shouted commands that sounded like a badly timed karaoke rendition of Ride of the Valkyries. Yet the wind, spiteful as a toddler denied candy, tried to toss them back toward the earth, shaking the balloon like a soda can shaken before a crash. In spite of the chaos, the balloon held steady, its heart, an inferno of flame, pulsing defiantly against the tempest. Inside the basket, a nervous inventor clutched his notebook, scribbling furiously as if the gale might erase his equations like a bad Instagram filter. A cheeky onlooker quipped that they were now auditioning for the role of the Flying Dutchman, only with less ghostly drama and more soot. The wind howled, sounding suspiciously like a vintage car, engine revving in a 1970s chase scene, prompting a laugh that cut through the tension like a knife through butter. Despite the turbulence, the crew coordinated their movements with the precision of a well-rehearsed flash mob, pulling ropes, adjusting burners, and sharing a stale baguette that smelled faintly of cheese and bravery. The irony was palpable. They were fighting the very air they loved, proving that even the heavens have a sense of humor. When the gale finally relented, El steadied, soaring above the last flickers of twilight like a phoenix refusing to be grounded. The crowd below erupted into a roar that echoed across the valley, a chorus of triumph, disbelief, and a few relieved sighs of those who'd feared a spectacular crash. The balloon drifted onward, its envelope now a dark silhouette against a sky studded with constellations that seemed to salute the daring ascent. As the descent began, the basket's rope creaked, the burners cooled, and the riders felt a profound gratitude for the simple, gritty reality of wind-kissed cheeks and soot-stained hands. In that moment, the world witnessed a bold declaration. Humanity could not only dream of the heavens, but could also hitch a ride and enjoy the view, popcorn in hand. When the wicker basket finally kissed the muddy field, Etienne and Amélie tumbled out like two bewildered circus clowns, their soot-smudged faces shining in the lantern light. The crowd erupted, a cacophony of oohs, claps, and a few drunken shouts of encore. That made the farmer's goats stare in bewilderment. The air still smelled of burnt pitch and fresh hay, a pungent reminder of the fire that had lifted them into the twilight. The children scrambled for scraps of the torn canvas, while an old baker offered them stale baguettes as if they were medals. Even the village dog barked a triumphant howl, as if to say, "You guys finally made it back without turning into a flying saucer." Back in the town hall, Etienne spread out a crumpled sketch of the balloon's envelope, its ribs like a giant honeycomb, while Amélie demonstrated how to balance the sandbags with the flair of a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Their voices rose over the crackle of the fireplace, turning complex physics into stories about wind-whispering dragons and sky-hungry pigeons. The apprentices, eyes wide as saucers, tried to mimic the gentle tug on the rope, only to stumble into a heap of giggles and a few bruised knees. By the end of the night, the town's blacksmith had fashioned a brass valve that squeaked like a squeaky toy, and the baker swore he could now smell the altitude in his sourdough. The whole affair felt like a Renaissance fair meets a TED Talk, with more flour and fewer PowerPoints. Soon the duo's handwritten chronicles, filled with ink-stained margins, doodles of clouds shaped like famous faces, and a marginal note about a runaway goose, were copied by monks who thought the word aeronaut sounded like a new type of cheese. Those parchments traveled farther than the balloon ever did, landing on the desks of curious nobles who dreamed of soaring above their own estates. Within a decade, inventors in distant cities built their own wicker cages, each one a tribute to that first twilight flight, complete with brass bells that jingled like a pirate's treasure chest. The air became a new highway, and the phrase "up in the clouds" stopped being a metaphor and became a literal commute for some eccentric aristocrats. Historians later joked that the only thing more contagious than the balloon fever was the smell of burnt canvas that seemed to follow every new launch. Even now, when the sun dips low and the sky blushes orange, you can hear the faint sigh of a balloon envelope straining against the wind, a ghost of that first twilight ride. The scent of heated sand and fresh rope lingers in the night air, mingling with the earthy perfume of damp fields and distant campfires. Each newly inflated balloon, bobbing like a nervous hamster on a string, carries a piece of Etienne and Amelie's daring spirit, its colors flashing against the horizon like a superhero cape. Travelers swear they feel a gentle tug on their hearts, as if the balloon itself is whispering, "Remember the night we chased the sunset." And somewhere, a lone goat still bleats in the background, a reminder that even the most lofty dreams have humble, stubborn roots. So when you see a balloon drift lazily over a modern city, think of the two intrepid French folk who once rode a basket of fire and felt the world melt into a watercolor at dusk. Their legacy is as sturdy as the wicker ribs and as fragile as the silk panels that once fluttered in the wind, a perfect paradox that would make even a Marvel superhero raise an eyebrow. Children today still try to mimic their daring by attaching helium balloons to their backpacks, only to be grounded by the inevitable pop of a squeaky rubber valve, nature's way of saying, "Not so fast, kiddo." Yet the laughter that follows, the squeals of delight, and the shared gasp at a sunrise from above keep the spirit alive. In the end, Etienne and Amélie's story reminds us that the sky isn't a limit. It's just the next great punchline in humanity's endless comedy of ambition.